In 1973, the US Supreme Court made history in the case of Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court justices ruled that the Constitution of the United States protected a pregnant woman's right to an abortion, and for almost 50 years, it was in many US states the only legal protection for those seeking termination. But 12 months ago, the court once again made history by overturning its own decision. On the 24th of June 2022, life and law for women across the US changed, with some states immediately recriminalising, well, not just anyone seeking an abortion, but also the medical professionals providing them. Our US correspondent Marth Kelner was at the Supreme Court the day it stated that Roe versus Wade was egregiously wrong from the start. A year on, she joins me to reflect on its decision. We'll be hearing from a woman who was denied access to a legal abortion, the doctors whose hands are tied, and the lawmakers responsible for the most controversial changes to reproductive rights in US history. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Martha, good to have you back on the Daily. Look, the overturning of Roe versus Wade has been in the news for quite a while now, but it is a complicated legal decision. So just walk us through it. What exactly was the significance of the case?
Roe versus Wade was a 1973 landmark ruling on an abortion case. It concerned, very briefly, a 25-year-old woman, Norma McCorvey, in Texas. She used the alias Jane Roe. She said she'd been raped and become pregnant and was forced to give birth because of criminal abortion laws in Texas. On the other side, defending the anti-abortion law, was a lawyer named Henry Wade, hence why this case became known as Roe versus Wade. And the Supreme Court ruling in 1973 said that the government couldn't prohibit abortions because of the constitutional right to liberty, which includes the right to decide whether or not to continue a pregnancy. So a woman's right to choose up to the point of fetal viability, which is when it's widely accepted that a baby could survive outside of the womb, that effectively became a constitutional right. And yet, a year ago, the Supreme Court did that which so many people in the United States thought unthinkable. Yeah, they did. I mean, very few people 10, 15 years ago thought that Roe versus Wade would ever be overturned. I think we see laws evolving to offer more liberty rather than to remove certain elements of liberty. And I think that's why you saw such widespread shock and anger at the time. I was outside the Supreme Court, this grand, gleaming, white-pillared building on the day that that decision was overturned. And the feeling has stuck with me. And I think what struck me most is just how much it highlighted the division within America. It is one of these issues which is so polarising. And of course, in the year since that ruling was handed down, a ruling which in essence overturned Roe versus Wade, a number of states have had the opportunity and have taken the opportunity to introduce, near total bans on abortion, even in cases where incest and rape have taken place. Yeah, and I think what we've seen, Neil, is this complex patchwork of abortion laws across the country, which are divided geographically. They're also divided politically. In 14 states, as you mentioned, almost all abortions are banned with no exception for rape or incest. Those states cover vast swathes of the Deep South, mostly Republican voting states, places like Alabama, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi. Other states in the South have introduced gestation limits. So, for instance, in Georgia, abortion is banned after 6 weeks. Florida is also trying to force through a 6-week abortion ban. There's an additional 8 states which have had their bans blocked. And then there's some democratic states which are styling themselves as, so-called safe havens. So places like New York and California, their governors are actually using it as a bit of a campaigning tool, saying women will be safe to travel to their states to seek abortion healthcare. But I think for women who are pregnant and who perhaps for whatever reason don't want to continue with their pregnancy, it is a state of complete chaos, because you've not just got these laws and these bans, it's the fact that there's such a lack of clarity over what and when they can have an abortion.
Ahead of the anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, you've been taking a very close look at one state, Tennessee. Just describe exactly what the situation is, the state of the law there.
Yeah, so Tennessee had a trigger law in place. This means it was a law that was established before Roe versus Wade was abolished. So as soon as Roe versus Wade was overturned, this trigger law became possible. It actually came into effect in Tennessee around the end of August. The initial law meant that abortion was banned with no exceptions for rape or incest. There was an exception to save the life of the mother, but this law said that abortion providers could be charged with a felony. So that's a very serious crime that can carry with it prison terms. And there was something baked into this law called affirmative defence, which meant that those abortion providers were guilty until proven innocent. They had to defend themselves in court in order to prove that the procedure was done to save the life of a pregnant patient, a position which no doctor wants to find themselves in.
Well, clearly not. And we will be coming back to the doctors in just a moment. But can we talk about the women involved in this? And you've been speaking to one mother. She had a very personal experience of the change in the law. Just describe what happened to her.
Yeah, Myron Hollis is a factory insulation worker who lives in Clarksville, Tennessee. She survives paycheck to paycheck. Her daughter Zoe was 5 months old when she unexpectedly found out she was pregnant again. A surprise, but a welcome one. They were looking forward to having another child, her and her husband, Chris. But when she went for her initial checkup, the doctor there told her that her embryo had implanted in the caesarean section. So this was what's known as an ectopic pregnancy. It means when a pregnancy takes place outside the uterus, and she was told her uterus could rupture at any point, that it carried the risk of serious bleeding, internal bleeding. So she was told that she should seek an abortion.
He told me I had no choice. Like, at that time it was no, he said I did not have a choice. You know, he said it could kill me, like it was life or death.
Eventually, though, they decide that this is so life-threatening. She has other children to support, that she wants to go ahead with the abortion. But between the period of being told she should have abortion and eventually making the decision, this trigger law comes into place. The doctor who was initially going to be providing the abortion withdrew. So that possibility of abortion was taken out of Myron Hollis's hands. And for her entire pregnancy, she has hanging over her the fact that at any point she could hemorrhage internally and bleed to death.
And they couldn't even guarantee me the baby would be all right. He's like, you know, you might die and the baby might die. And, it was, I'm like, then why? And I just didn't understand why he couldn't help me.
Let me just try and just sum up the situation, just for clarity. So, Myron has an ectopic pregnancy. Her doctor recommends an abortion. The laws change in Tennessee. The doctor who recommended that abortion doesn't feel that he can carry it out because the doctor would be presumed guilty of an offence until proven otherwise. It is a horrible, horrible situation for a woman to find herself in. But I suppose that the question that needs to be asked, if this was such a dire set of circumstances, she would have been permitted to leave Tennessee to seek an abortion in a state where it was legal and then return to her home state, wouldn't she?
She would have been, and that is something that she and her husband, Chris, considered doing. I think what you need to know about Myron Hollis when you think about travelling out of state is that she is living on or below the poverty line. Flights in America are expensive. She would have had to take time off work, as would her husband. They would have had to find childcare for her existing children, including, a child who was barely a year old at that point. She simply did not have the money or the means or the opportunity to travel out of state. It is not that simple.
So what, Martha, has happened with Myron?
I think the difficult part of telling Myron's story is that in many ways there is a kind of happy ending, in that when I visited her in Clarksville, Tennessee, she has both her 18-month-old daughter, Zoe, and she also has her 5-month-old daughter, Elena. Elena, the baby, survived, albeit with very serious health problems initially. She spent the first 2 months of her life in intensive care. She's also stopped breathing on 2 occasions. Her mother had to give her CPR on one occasion. On another occasion, a policeman who happened to come to her aid gave the baby, who is barely the size of a normal newborn, CPR on the top of his patrol car. They are in and out of hospital despite their money issues. They have bills mounting up. Myron also almost bled to death on 2 occasions during her pregnancy. She hemorrhaged to the extent that their entire house was covered with blood. If that's not too gory, she had to have a hysterectomy. So she had to have her womb removed, which means that she can no longer have any other children naturally. So Myron says it is a blessing because she has Elena and that they're very lucky to both be alive. But she also points out that it could quite easily have gone the other way. They could quite easily both have died. In many ways, I think she feels like she's had her liberty taken away from her. And I think when you hear her story, it's not difficult to understand why she feels that way.
They took everything. Like, what else did I have? I didn't even feel like a woman at that point. Like, felt like I had no rights. I felt like just alone. We were alone in this situation. Me and my husband were very alone.
I suspect that in Tennessee, anti-abortionists would use Myron's story as an example of the law working, the law doing exactly what it was meant to do, stopping someone from, in their minds, murdering a baby and bringing a life into this world.
Yeah, I think the anti-abortion activists would no doubt see Myron and Elena's story as a victory. But having spoken to maternal fetal medicine specialists in Tennessee, they say this is not a win. Just because they, by chance, happen to both survive, this shouldn't be seen as a victory. But definitely, I think, they could potentially be, the poster advert for anti-abortion activists who say, this baby's survived, so this law has done its job.
Understandably, we have been focusing on the women who have been affected by these changes to the law, the patients. But I suppose there is a question to be asked about the medical practitioners themselves, that if you are a doctor working in Obgyn, as they say in the United States, would you want to be working in a state where the laws had been changed so that you could not make decisions on behalf of your patient that you knew that were in their best interest because of a change to the law?
Yeah, and I think there have been, a lot of OB-GYNs, a lot of maternal fetal medicine specialists in America who have reconsidered their career. These are people who years ago, decades ago, in many circumstances, signed a Hippocratic oath to put ethics first and foremost in caring for their patients, to give their patients the best possible care. And they don't feel, in the current circumstances in certain states in America, that they're able to do that. I spoke, for example, to Sarah Ombudsman, a maternal fetal medicine practitioner in Tennessee. She actually cared for Myron Hollis, and she says that the new laws in Tennessee have limited her ability to make the right decisions for her patients. She said she considered moving out of state. She said she was living in daily fear that she may have to make a decision which would leave her open to prosecution, that she was risking making a decision that might in the future end up with her in prison.
How does that make you feel that you're having to take this personal risk?
Angry. I mean, that's part of why I'm talking about this, is that, I don't feel like I don't feel like our patients should be put in these positions. I don't feel like as physicians we should be in these positions to even have to consider those kinds of legal questions when making patient care decisions. These are incredibly difficult situations for patients to go through, and it's difficult as physicians to care and counsel those patients. Like, it should be 100% about the personal decision in that small setting, rather than what a lawyer in the state legislature thinks about abortion.
Martha, I mean, you have even spoken with one of these lawmakers, Senator Richard Briggs. Now, he voted yes to total abortion bans that would be placing doctors in very hot legal water. Even he's admitting that these all-out bans aren't fit for purpose.
Senator, when you co-sponsored this Right to Life bill in 2019, thinking it'll probably never happen because Roe versus Wade will never be overturned, were you playing chicken with the lives of women in Tennessee?
Well, I don't think so. I think that's a very legitimate question, by the way. I don't think so because, first of all, we didn't think, and you'll hear a lot of people say, we didn't think that Roe versus Wade would be ever overturned. And then the second part of that is, it's like a lot of bills, we come back and revise the bill, and that's exactly what we did in this case.
I mean, these laws are constantly shifting around, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the abortion laws are moving such a lot at the moment that it's almost difficult to keep track of, because often a law gets passed and then there's an injunction, or there's a law which then is altered down the road. And that's what you saw happen in Tennessee. So Tennessee had one of, if not the strictest abortion law. But there was a change to this law, which the governor of the state, Bill Lee, reluctantly signed, which means now that affirmative defence is struck out from the law, which means that a doctor now must only prove that they were acting responsibly. So it reduces the legal risk for them, certainly. But from speaking to doctors in Tennessee, they feel like it really doesn't go far enough.
Let's take ourselves out of the great state of Tennessee just for a second, Martha, and dwell on what, if anything, has been the fight back, the attempt to try and roll back on that Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade.
I don't think anyone realistically expects any change to the Supreme Court ruling anytime soon. But also no one really expects any sort of federal ban on abortion. There doesn't seem to be an appetite at the moment for a national ban. So it is likely to stay in the hands of the individual states. One thing I would say is that abortion is likely to be a big issue in the 2024 presidential election. This we saw in the midterms that abortion is something that voters have in their minds when they're at the ballot box. And I think politicians at the moment are being quite smart about where they position themselves on abortion. Republican politicians don't want to be seen to go too far right, I don't think, because they know that abortion is not a big vote winner, and in fact it's more of a vote loser.
These stories out of the United States are deeply, deeply concerning. And as long as, I suppose, the legal situation remains the same, we're going to continue hearing them.
Yeah, and I think one of the most difficult things is hearing the stories of women who have had difficulties accessing abortion, even when there is no chance of their baby surviving outside the womb. So, for instance, I spoke to a woman in Florida, a woman named Deborah Dauber, and she was pregnant with a second child, a child that was much hoped for, together with her husband, Lee. And she had scans up to 20 weeks and everything looked fine. And then at her 23-week scan, everything changed. She had a scan which showed up that the baby that she was carrying had no kidneys. The unborn baby, was later diagnosed with Potter syndrome, which was incompatible with survival. There was no way that this baby was going to survive. But because of Florida's abortion laws, no doctor was willing to take the risk to provide her with an early medical termination of that pregnancy. So for 13 weeks, she carried a baby which she knew wasn't going to survive. And I think personally that affected me such a lot, because just a few weeks before Roe versus Wade was overturned, I got a video call from my oldest sister, who was pregnant with her first child, and her husband, and they told me that they had, in a very similar vein to Deborah, been told at 32 weeks pregnant that their baby wouldn't survive either. It had a condition called tuberous sclerosis. And my sister said, in fact, only last week, she said, you know, the only thing that you can do for someone in that position is offer them compassion. For many people, it's the worst news they're ever going to receive. But to be treated with dignity makes such a difference. And to hear the stories of these women who have had that choice taken away from them, who are treated so badly in the worst moments of their lives, is just completely heartbreaking. And I think for many of them, they feel it's unforgivable.
That's your lot for the Daily for today with me, Niall Paterson. My thanks, of course, to Marth Kelner. This episode was produced by Sydney Peat and Rosie Gillett, with Amy Lakin and Sarah Goff. Our editor is Adam J.